Hi everyone, my name is Savannah Morgan and I'm a second-year PhD student in the Agricultural and Biological Engineering Department. Today I'll be talking to you about a paper titled The Association Between Neighborhood Greenness and Cardiovascular Disease, an observational study done by Gavin Piera and Sarah Foster. So this study sparked my interest because I watched a documentary in the past called Unnatural Causes, and it looked at how one's access to certain resources or one's environment can impact their stress levels, and how chronic stress can lead to long-term health risks, such as risk of cardiovascular disease. I found this fascinating that one's access to certain resources or environment can define their health. And so I wanted to look into the resource green space and how one's access to green space can impact their long-term health risk of cardiovascular disease. Here I'll define what greenness is and also talk about cardiovascular disease. Cardiovascular disease is the leading single cause of death across the world, and it's projected to remain so by 2030. Coronary heart disease includes various different heart disorders such as stroke, heart attack, and high blood pressure. Here on this map you see a distribution of rate of deaths per 100,000 for heart attacks. As you can see, it's very high. There are both modifiable and non-modifiable risks, and the risk factor of interest for this study is physical inactivity. Previous studies have looked at greenness and its impact on physical activity. They found that proximity to parks and a greater land use mix can lead to an increase in physical activity. However, there are a few studies that have looked at the relationship between green space and access to green space and one's risk of cardiovascular morbidity. So this is what was of interest for this study. They're looking at Perth, Australia, and they're investigating the effect of neighborhood greenness on both self-reported and hospitalization of coronary heart disease or stroke. They account for behavioral, biological, and habitat factors. This study is a cross-sectional study. There are 11,404 participants of this study. The participants answered a survey done in Australia between the years of 2003 and 2009. In this survey, they reported whether or not they had a history of cardiovascular disease or stroke. The respondents allowed the study to use their hospitalization records. So the outcome variables are whether or not the person accounted for a history of heart disease and whether or not they were hospitalized within a 3-year window of taking the survey for cardiovascular disease. Greenness is also an interest for this study, and so that was studied with the Normalized Difference Vegetation Index. And then multiple regression models were used to analyze all the different factors involved in this study. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about the survey. The survey not only accounted for one's medical history, but also socio-demographics such as age, and then other biological factors such as BMI, as well as behavioral factors such as diet and smoking. Control and sick groups were defined as following. If a person reported that they had been previously diagnosed with a heart disease or stroke, they would be considered to be sick. If they also were admitted for stroke or heart disease within a 3-year gap of taking the survey, they would be considered sick. The rest would be the control group. So 85% of the respondents are in the control group. Here is a list of all the different factors that were involved in this study. And I'll talk about the habitat factor, air quality, and greenness, and how it was measured with GIS. The neighborhood was defined as a 1,600 meter service area, and this was defined because previous studies have shown that if a park was within 1,600 meters of a person's home, then if they walked all the way to that park and back, they would have a sufficient amount of physical activity to be considered a physically active person. Air pollution is also of importance for this study, as previous studies have shown that traffic air pollution can impact one's risk of cardiovascular disease, and so that was measured using GIS as well. Previous literature has shown that exposure zone for traffic air pollution is between 300 meters and 500 meters of a major road, and so this study focused on 400 meters from a major road. Major roads were defined as roads that traversed more than 6,000 cars a day, and the roads came from the Metropolitan Road Network. Now, greenness was measured with the Landsat TM remote sensing imagery. Its units range from -1 to +1. If it was -1, that means it was water and it was areas of no greenness at all. If it was +1, that meant it was complete greenness, so like forest. The one of interest for this study is variability in greenness, so we're looking more into the in between -1 and +1. And this unit was defined with the normalized difference vegetation index. They looked at both mean and standard deviation for the respondents' area. And then they analyzed continuous and categorical variables. Here we see a picture that is an example of what high variability of greenness would be. As you can see, there's both a mixture of lighter areas, which would be low greenness, and grayish and darker grayish areas that would be higher amounts of greenness. Here, this is a more low variability of greenness. As you can see, there's darker areas are more consolidated together, and lighter areas are more consolidated together. There were 3 tertiles for greenness. There was low, medium, and high, and this was for both mean and standard deviation of greenness. The low, mean, and standard deviation of greenness is the reference level for the odds ratio. So now I'm going to get into the results. Here we see the table of the odds ratios for the various different models investigated. And as you can see, some of the numbers are bolded. Bolded numbers mean that the odds ratio was statistically significant at the 95% confidence level. So for the self-reported diagnosis with coronary heart disease or stroke, 3 variables of interest were statistically significant: the medium mean greenness, the medium standard deviation of greenness, and the high level of greenness variation standard deviation. All of these, as you can see, are close to 1. And now moving on to the hospitalization of coronary heart disease or stroke, only one of the odd ratio of interest was statistically significant, and that was the high variability standard deviation of greenness. And that is also close to 1. So what does this mean? It means that there is a protective association between variability of neighborhood greenness and coronary heart disease or stroke. The odds of hospitalization is 37% lower among adults with high variable greenness around their home compared to those with low variability of greenness. Furthermore, the odds of self-reported heart disease is 16% lower among adults with high variable greenness around their home compared to those with low variability of greenness. For mean greenness, there was a weaker evidence for association, as you saw previously that the variables were not statistically significant at the 95% confidence level. So what does this study indicate? Well, it may indicate that neighborhood greenness variability can lead to more physical activity, which will decrease odds for heart disease, since we know that physical inactivity is a modifiable risk factor of cardiovascular disease. Future studies should look into how specific attributes of neighborhoods, such as trees along sidewalks, can impact physical activity, thus cardiovascular disease. There were some limitations of this study. One limitation is that they did not account for physical activity, as it was not a question in the survey, and so there could be a chance of overlay of people who lived in more green land use mix areas are more physically active. Furthermore, there was not an adjustment made for known risk factors for cardiovascular disease, as it was also not in the survey. Lastly, the imagery obtained from the remote sensing is accurate to a certain level of resolution, but if there were at a smaller level more just trees sporadically put out in the neighborhood, that would not have been accounted for in the remote sensing imagery. So in conclusion, coronary heart disease and stroke was negatively associated with neighborhood greenness. Thank you all, and here are my references.